So in this class, we'll introduce both lab and field experiments. So you might be using both. If you are a user experience engineer or UX designer, you probably will be conducting a lot of lab experiments. If you're a data scientist working at one of the IT companies, you'll probably be doing a lot of field experiments. So let's use both methods, and they are complementary. So the foundational paper for the method of conducting lab experiments is Smith 82, and a survey and a general framework set up on field experiments is by Harrison and List. So let's go through each of these papers. Vernon Smith is a Nobel laureate in economics in the year 2002, and he is one of the pioneers in experimental economics. And so one of the most important contributions that he made to the methodology, to the field, is the induced value theory, and that really laid the foundation for lab experiments. So what's it like to be a participant in a lab experiment? You will experience that as part of the exercise for this week. You will be participating in some auction experiments. You don't necessarily have to be in a lab, but this experiment has all the components of a lab experiment. So first of all, the experimenter controls the environment. So the experimenter decides how much endowment a subject gets, what's the monetary incentive, and what's the technology used to deliver these different treatments. The second component is the institutions and rules. So everyone has an action space. That's the different options that you can choose from. There's a sequence that the action takes place, and there are information conditions. So these are what you're told about this game or this experiment. And the last part is the framing. We use natural language. This is the instructions, what you're told about the environment, the institutions, the rules, the other participants. So you will experience all of this in the auction experiment. So let me go through the induced value theory, which is developed to set up a controlled experiment. So the first component is why we need induced value theory. Why is it important to have subjects perform like real-world subjects? So in some experiments, for instance, in some psychology experiments, the experimenter introduce the experiment and say, do your best. Everyone's paid a lump sum to compensate for their time in the lab. Whereas the induced value theory says, essentially, the subjects has to be rewarded based on their performance. In other words, there is a proper use of a reward medium which allows an experimenter to induce pre-specified characteristics in experimental subjects. So this reward medium should satisfy three conditions. One is monotonicity, which means that the subjects prefer more reward medium to less. And so money would satisfy this. In most of the cases, though, participants would prefer more money to less money. The second condition is salience. That is, the reward depends on the subject's actions. So if you're in a trading environment and you lose money, your total reward should go down as a result of you losing money. Whereas if you make good decisions, your reward should also go up. In other words, lump sum payment, as we talked about before, would not satisfy the salience condition. The third condition is dominance, which is the change in subject's utility come predominantly from the reward medium. This actually dictates a certain number of experimental rules. For instance, it's important to maintain privacy. It's important that subjects' decisions are not publicized to other subjects. For instance, suppose one subject is made worse off because of another subject's decision, and privacy is not kept. As a result, there might be ramifications after the experiment is over. So the induced value theory dictates that there is a set of practical implications in design. So, for instance, we often pay our subjects in cash. How about grades? If you have student subjects, why don't you pay them in grades? That's much cheaper than cash. The problem with grades is if the class is curved, then subjects don't just care about their own grade, the number of points. They also care about how they compare to the rest of the subjects. Which condition does it violate? If we go back to the three conditions, it would violate dominance because the changes in subjects' utility come from not just the reward median, but also the relative position of how I perform compared to others. So you have to be very careful when you pay subjects grades, grade points. That the amount a subject earns in the experiment should depend on the subject's actions in the experiment. It also means that the average payment should be higher than the opportunity cost. That will ensure you that the subjects would actually want to come and participate in the experiment. As an experimenter, you want to create the simplest possible environment. We already talked about the role of privacy of subjects' actions and payoffs. And the last part, which is sometimes difficult to do, is you should not deceive the subjects or lie to them. And this is because lots of times the theoretical prediction is based on the belief distribution. And if you deceive your subjects, they don't believe you anymore. An example for lying is a recent experiment conducted on Facebook by Kramer et al. So the researchers wanted to study whether emotions are contagious through social networks. To do so, they assign subjects to a positive emotion treatment versus a negative emotion treatment. How do they do that? They manipulate what kind of messages are displayed to you. So if your friends posted a message which is very positive, but you are in the negative treatment, then you won't be shown these messages. Needless to say, this is deception, and it should not be done. So we're going to use some auction experiments. So we talked a lot about induced value theory and how you implement it in the lab. We're going to demonstrate it by a lab experiment that's set up using the induced value theory. And they're both auction experiments. They're first price seal bid auctions and second price seal bid auctions. You can go to MobLab and finish these two auction experiments. So to motivate you, the points you earned in these experiments actually count towards your grade, and we're not grading on a curve. So it does satisfy our three conditions for the proper reward medium, and you want to earn as many points as possible in the experiment. Have fun.